In a beautiful and remote corner of the Italian countryside stands an enigmatic monastery whose skeletal ruins emerge unexpectedly from the dark trees and mist. Its decay cannot conceal the fact that in its time it was undoubtedly an enormous and majestic building, imposing in presence and solidly constructed, beautifully and lavishly decorated. But upon closer inspection, it becomes clear that despite its astonishing size and exquisite ornamentation, its construction was never completed. Walls and roofs remain unfinished, leaving shadowy rooms and passageways exposed to the elements, while the different parts of the building are arranged in a symmetry abruptly interrupted by the sections that were never built. Yet, inexplicably, despite the centuries that have passed, the grounds remain devoid of vegetation, as if still awaiting the completion of the works. It was our tour guide on the coach during our trip through Italy who explained, as the sinister silhouette of the monastery came into view on the horizon, that it was a place avoided by locals and visited by very few tourists, despite its magnificence. Those few who had dared to explore the cloisters and passageways of the abbey claimed upon their return to have felt overcome by an inexplicable unease, to have heard ethereal murmurs, and even to have seen unsettling, shadowy figures wandering the desolate rooms. For that unfinished and abandoned monastery was shrouded in the legend that the inhabitants of the nearby villages called the architect's soul. The legend told that during the Renaissance, there lived in that region a brilliant young architect who, through sheer perseverance and determination, managed to complete his studies and graduate, overcoming financial difficulties and even his family's opposition. He had also married a beautiful and virtuous young woman with whom he was completely enamored, and who reciprocated his feelings. But this happiness was overshadowed by the difficulty of finding commissions that would allow him to put his knowledge and skills to use, and by the worry of the considerable debts he had accumulated from his studies and marriage. Then one day, the young architect's luck seemed about to change at last when he was unexpectedly visited by several clergymen, visibly worried, sent by the bishop himself to offer him the direction of the construction of a new monastery. The recently appointed prelate wished it to be one of the grandest in Christendom, and its construction had been entrusted to a famous architect who had just died suddenly. This unexpected death had caused the bishop profound grief, as he had committed considerable financial resources and his own prestige to the project, and he urgently needed an architect to continue the work. The young man immediately understood that this was the opportunity of a lifetime, the chance he had been waiting for years to demonstrate his genius to the world and thus make a name for himself among the greatest architects in history. Encouraged by his wife, who was also thrilled by this stroke of luck, he accepted the commission without hesitation. The bishop himself handed over all the plans and designs of the ill-fated architect and accompanied the enthusiastic young man to the abbey construction site to vaguely explain some of his wishes and ideas regarding the building's characteristics. He granted the young man ample freedom to develop his work and apply all his talent, guaranteeing him all the necessary financial resources so that he would spare no expense in the beauty and magnificence of the undertaking. The architect assured the prelate that he would not disappoint him and that he would build, for the glory of God and his church, the most majestic monastery ever seen in Europe. And so, that young architect began his work on the project he was convinced would place him among the greatest names in architecture, for he was determined to fulfill the bishop's wishes and ensure that the abbey would be known and admired throughout the world. And perhaps also to feed his own pride. Although the previous builder's plans were extremely detailed and revealed the magnificence of the projected building, the protagonist of this legend was determined to completely redesign it so that it would showcase his incomparable taste, creativity, and highly personal style. For countless hours the architect worked in his studio over the worn plans, by candlelight, staring intently at them, barely moving, while his thoughts swirled in a frenzied vortex. Yet, he found no inspiration from which to spring an idea that would truly satisfy him and be worthy of being incorporated into his new plans. Whether it was due to his desire not to disappoint the expectations he knew the ecclesiastical dignitaries had placed in his work, or to the ambition of conceiving and realizing a project that would bring him the admiration and renown his ambition craved, the genius that had allowed him to easily surpass all the projects his university professors had proposed during his studies, and for which he had earned their admiration, now seemed to elude him, much to his frustration and dismay. Overcome by the deepest unease, he compulsively consulted books and treatises, studied plans and sketches of the greatest and most renowned works of his time and of antiquity, but in no text or in any illustration did he find any concept or approach that would free his thinking from the quagmire in which his inspiration seemed to have sunk, and when, on a few occasions, the glimmer of some idea that seemed promising managed to blaze in his head, it quickly vanished when, as his strokes began to fill the void of the parchments, the new approach was besieged by doubts about its technical viability and unforeseen difficulties in linking and cohesifying the different parts of the monastery. Sleepless nights were followed by days of tireless and restless work, and these soon turned into weeks, with the architect having made virtually no significant progress on the project. The clergy of the diocese and the foremen of the masons were beginning to grow impatient and demand that work resume, while frustration and despair gripped the young man due to this exasperating lack of inspiration to respond to the illustrious project he had embarked upon, a project in which not only the church hierarchy but also he himself had placed such high hopes. Not even his wife's affection and words of encouragement could alleviate his sorrow. Such was the young architect's anguish that one night, overcome by anger and despair, he abruptly threw all his plans and sketches from his desk, and not wanting to make any more noise that might wake his wife and neighbors, he impetuously left his house and began to walk aimlessly through the dark streets, trying to calm himself in the biting cold and silence of that bright moonlit night. His erratic steps eventually led him, after a long and disoriented walk, without him even realizing it, to the construction site of the great monastery, and there, among the languid walls and skeletal scaffolding illuminated by the ghostly clarity of the moon, now blinded by anger and frustration, he pounded a block of stone with his hands until they hurt intensely, and cursed his incompetence and lack of inspiration just when he had the project of his life in his hands, uttering unspeakable blasphemies and assuring that he would give up everything he owned and everything he loved in exchange for being able to complete that work. It is said that the young man had barely finished uttering those foolish words when, above his ragged breathing and the pain in his arms, he felt a sudden, paralyzing, and unhealthy breeze stir, seemingly carrying an unpleasant sulphurous odor and ghostly whispers. This current provoked unease, even fear, in the architect, who took a few steps away from that place until the manifestation ceased as abruptly as it had begun. By then, his anger had begun to dissipate amidst the stillness of the night and the steely cold, which made the now more composed architect shiver. Having finally regained his composure and sanity after that outburst, and now overcome by a deep disquiet, he prepared to return home. But then, as he turned a corner, the architect unexpectedly found himself facing a shadowy figure standing in the middle of the passageway, silently observing him, motionless. It appeared to be a man dressed in a ragged, disheveled white habit, covered with disturbing and unholy red or black symbols and writing. Beneath the hood, the moonlight revealed the features of a decrepit old man, monstrous yet demonic in appearance, with grayish, wrinkled skin covered in pustules, and eyes and mouth that seemed to be empty of unfathomable darkness. Again, an icy breath filled the air, and the smell of sulfur was much stronger than before, as the sinister old man stroked a wall with his hand, leaving a blackened mark as if an incandescent object had touched it. An overwhelming terror and an instinctive urge to escape seized the young man as he beheld that disturbing apparition. He quickly realized it could only be a creature of darkness, but his body and limbs remained motionless, refusing to respond to his impulses, as if paralyzed by an invisible and irresistible force. But the demon, in an ethereal, whispering voice, greeted the human with petulant courtesy and praised the magnificence of the work, which he had no doubt was destined for the glory and admiration of mortals. He also lamented that it had not been completed due to a lack of creativity, or perhaps, a lack of ability. Those insidious words wounded the architect's pride and confidence like icy daggers. Moved by an impulse that could only have come from the demon's malevolent influence, he shared his fear and frustration. In a condescending tone, the demon took pity on the architect and finally assured him that if he was truly willing to give up everything he possessed and everything he loved, perhaps he could help him. Then the shadowy specter offered the architect the creativity and audacity necessary to make that abbey the most magnificent in Christendom, a work that would be admired in the four corners of the world and that would make him the most famous and renowned architect the centuries had ever seen, all this in exchange for his soul, which he would have to surrender the moment the monastery's construction was completed, or ceased for any reason. The demon continued to tell the young architect many more things, seeming to know his anxieties, desires, and ambition perfectly, conjuring up images of grandeur, admiration, recognition, and wealth. These images gradually overcame his reluctance and silenced the prudence that cried out within him not to yield to the temptations offered by this impious spirit, who undoubtedly harbored evil intentions. But the visions the spectre evoked seemed to become real before the architect's eyes. His words were too suggestive, his arguments too persuasive, and the influence of his spell too powerful for any human will to resist. Finally, the hesitant young man, his voice thick with emotion, accepted the deal the demon offered. The sinister old man then appeared visibly pleased by this response, and with a sly and malicious expression assured the young architect that he would not regret it, before suddenly and tumultuously disappearing into a suffocating and foul-smelling mist. This miasma enveloped the bewildered architect, suffocating him until his very existence and the reality of the world seemed to vanish into unfathomable darkness. It was his wife's anguished voice that roused the architect from the dark nightmare into which his thoughts and his very life seemed to have plunged. He finally opened his eyes and realized it was already daytime, and that he was, inexplicably, in his own home. Still confused and unsure whether it had all been real or a distressing dream, the architect reassured his wife and affectionately expressed his love for her, ate breakfast, and went to his studio, almost resigned to spending another day unable to add anything new to his plans. But he had barely sat down at his desk when, seeing the empty parchments covering it, he felt his mind flooded with a sudden mental effervescence, from which a torrent of ideas and solutions began to emerge for each and every aspect of the project and for the problems and concerns whose unresolved nature had tormented him for so long. Euphoric, the young man took his pen and began feverishly drawing lines and making calculations on the plans, impatient to put down on them each and every one of the ideas and approaches, each one better than the last, that now filled his head, almost fearing that he would forget them, excited by that unexpected mental sharpness and the return of an inspiration that he thought had disappeared in him. Until late into the night the architect worked tirelessly in his studio, outlining every part of the monastery and efficiently and ingeniously solving any technical problem that arose in his designs, seized by a creative frenzy that did not seem to subside, until finally, when the sun was beginning to rise over the rooftops, the young man finished his plans, and ran enthusiastically to meet the foreman to inform them of the new plans and to have them gather the masons to resume the work. Thus, after the prolonged interruption, construction of the magnificent monastery resumed, to the delight of the bishop and his clergy. As the walls rose above the horizon and the naves took shape, the majesty and grandeur of the building soon became undeniable to all who observed the bustling construction, convincing even the skeptics that this sanctuary would possibly become the grandest and most renowned in Europe. Neither nobles nor commoners spared praise and admiration for the young architect, whose abilities, until recently, few had believed in, showering him with gifts and making generous contributions to the project, eager to participate in the culmination of such a distinguished work. But the young man had not forgotten the disturbing encounter with the mysterious old man of the monastery, and he soon realized that it had not been a dream, but reality, and that all those sudden blessings stemmed from the pact he had made with the devil. So, despite all those gifts and finally receiving the recognition he had longed for, as construction progressed smoothly, the architect felt a deep unease growing within him. He remembered that the devil's price for their bargain had been his own soul, to be surrendered as soon as the abbey's construction was completed, or even ceased. But in reality, the foreseeable surrender of his soul did not provoke the disquiet in the architect that one might have expected. His mind remained immersed in a spiral of creative inspiration, from which novel ideas and more visionary solutions for the project constantly sprang forth. And these new concepts soon awakened in the architect even greater enthusiasm than those already outlined in the plans, and a burning desire to bring them to fruition. The architect's euphoria and creativity quickly spread to the bishop himself, who readily authorized entire sections of the monastery, nearing completion, to be dismantled and rebuilt according to the new designs conceived by the fervent young man, time and time again. Months turned into years, and the construction of the abbey dragged on endlessly. Time and again, a nave or large sections of the building, nearly completed, were demolished to be rebuilt according to a new configuration or design conceived by the architect. This caused unrest among the workers and bewilderment among onlookers, but always met with the enthusiastic approval of the bishop, pleased with the grandeur of what he considered the crowning achievement of his episcopate. But no effort in that construction was undoubtedly greater than that of the architect at the heart of this legend. He worked tirelessly for long hours, day after day, on the monastery's plans in his studio, always inspired by some novel and visionary idea he had just conceived, which he rushed to commit to parchment and communicate to the foreman for implementation. In the meantime, he neglected his wife, other family and friends, and even his own health. It is said that he even appeared barely affected when both his wife and the child he was expecting died from complications during childbirth. After that tragedy, the architect seemed to withdraw even further into his work, completely neglecting every other aspect of his life. He spent entire days locked in his studio, barely eating, drinking, or washing himself, feverishly sketching onto the plans the new ideas that his boisterous creativity incessantly conceived, only leaving to inform the bishop and the foreman of the modifications he had made to the now unrecognizable project. His behavior, and his decrepit appearance, began to worry all those who saw and dealt with him, and even the ailing bishop, already elderly and ill, began to worry about it and about the inexplicable duration of the construction, and to raise some objections. They knew nothing of the curse of blazing and inexhaustible creativity that weighed upon the sorrowful young man as a result of his pact with a shadowy being, nor of the obsession with that magnificent work that it had provoked in him, for the architect, in his alienation, knew unquestionably that his own life was intrinsically linked to the construction of that building, which he had to continue indefinitely not only because he aspired for it to be the most splendid and majestic of all creation, but because he was aware that, at the very moment when its construction ended, his soul would be claimed by the demon with whom he had signed the unholy pact. But it so happened that one cold, gray morning, the architect, his face worn thin by years of hardship and exhausting labor, went to the construction site to propose a change to one of the cloisters. But there was no mason or foreman to be found. Instead, a group of richly dressed, high-ranking clergymen awaited him. For the bishop who had been his patron for years had finally died, and a new prelate had arrived from Rome, where the curia was outraged by the scandalous amount of money spent on the construction. Following these instructions, the new bishop informed the architect that work on the monastery was to be halted immediately and irrevocably. The architect bitterly protested this news, pleading with the bishop not to stop the construction, assuring him that it would be finished very soon. But the prelate was inflexible and angrily ordered the architect to return home if he didn't want to be arrested. The new bishop's halt to the construction plunged the architect into utter despair, for he knew it meant the devil could appear at any moment to claim his soul as payment for their pact. Driven to madness by anguish, the young man resolved to continue the monastery's construction alone if necessary, relying on his knowledge and guided by his own plans. For several weeks, the distraught architect toiled in solitude and silence, preparing mortar, assembling scaffolding and pulleys, moving and positioning heavy stone blocks, and performing other tasks he had never before undertaken, constantly cursing the bishop and pitifully praying that the devil would not return. Meanwhile, his creativity continued to blaze incessantly, so that even amidst the growing fatigue and the hardship of that work, his mind continued to conceive of novelties and improvements in the project, which he no longer even bothered to put down on paper, exasperated and impatient to see that the construction was practically not progressing and that there was still so much to do. The crazed architect barely ate or rested, consumed solely by the senseless zeal to continue the construction of that cursed monastery, which had become the reason and the very core of his life and existence. The growing fatigue and incessant anguish, however, gradually took their toll on the architect's body and spirit, as he struggled to ignore the increasingly evident deterioration fueled by despair and anger. But finally, a day came when the deranged architect's resistance and fortitude reached their limit, and his body succumbed irremediably to the unspeakable exhaustion. The young man fell to the ground, gasping and in pain beyond comprehension, feeling his wasted limbs finally cease to respond to his still burning zeal, and his life ebbed away without his being able to do anything. He still managed to bitterly lament the brilliant ideas he had been unable to realize in the project, and finally, he remembered his ill-fated wife and the child he had lost. With his last glimmers of life, He managed to vaguely distinguish a figure dressed in a white robe decorated with unsettling red and black symbols, approaching him walking among the unfinished walls of the monastery that finally claimed his soul.